September 4th, 2025. Inside York Crown Court, two young men faced the reality of choices that had already defined their lives. One was just 20 years old, the other only 23. Yet behind their fresh faces was a cocaine network that stretched across Scarborough and Filey, poisoning communities along the North Yorkshire coast. Their empire was not uncovered through months of undercover surveillance or elaborate sting operations, but through something far simpler, a seized phone. That single device revealed thousands of conversations about drug deals, over 300 separate message streams from eager customers, and photographs of cocaine being weighed, bagged, and mixed. It was evidence so overwhelming that there was no room left for denial. But the bigger question still lingers. How does a small seaside town, known more for beaches and tourism, become a marketplace for Class A drugs? And how could two men so young rise so quickly in a trade that thrives on misery and leaves entire communities scarred? To understand how a 20-year-old could end up running part of a cocaine supply chain, we need to look back at the troubled history of Myles Coe. His path into crime did not begin with large-scale drug dealing. It began with violence. In December 2022, Coe was only a teenager when he became involved in a brutal street attack in Filey. A group confrontation spiraled out of control, and one victim was left with serious injuries. The young man suffered a broken eye socket, fractures to his cheekbone, and lasting nerve damage after being punched and kicked while lying defenseless on the ground. Doctors later described his pain as unbearable, requiring morphine and extensive hospital treatment. For the victim, the consequences were life-changing. Blurred vision, numbness, anxiety, and a complete loss of confidence. For Coe, it marked his first serious brush with the law, a point where a different choice might have altered his future. Instead, just months later, Coe was arrested again. In May 2023, police stopped a vehicle in Scarborough carrying 4 young men. When Coe was searched, officers found more than 100 grams of cocaine hidden in his underwear. This was no small possession for personal use. It was a clear sign that he had moved beyond casual involvement and was now operating within the dangerous world of street-level supply. Prosecutors later confirmed that he had been actively dealing drugs, though at what they described as the lower end of the chain. Still, the quantity concealed on him showed intent to distribute, and it marked his first major step into the trade that would eventually define him. At his trial, defense lawyers painted a picture of a teenager struggling with his own addiction. They claimed Coe had built up debts with his dealer and had been pressured into selling drugs as repayment. It was a familiar story in communities where vulnerability and desperation are exploited by those higher up the ladder. Coe's counsel argued that he was attempting to leave behind a crack cocaine habit, even highlighting that he had been offered legitimate work as a steel erector. The judge, reading pre-sentence reports, described Coe as a damned idiot, but stopped short of sending him to prison. Instead, he was given a suspended sentence, ordered to complete unpaid work, and placed on rehabilitation programs. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might have a chance to change course. Yet, the lessons of that suspended sentence never took root. Coe's violent behavior, his willingness to carry drugs in bulk, and his increasing involvement with known associates pointed toward a young man who was not stepping away from crime, but rather sliding deeper into it. The contrast could not have been more stark. At an age when many of his peers were beginning apprenticeships, university courses, or careers, Coe was carving out a reputation in Filey for violence and drug connections. His choices pushed him further into the world of organized supply, where profits came quickly, but the risks grew larger with every deal. This was the foundation for the cocaine network that would later place him at the center of a major police investigation. Behind the courtroom headlines lay a web of 3 young men who decided that quick money was worth more than a clean future. At the center was Myles Coe. At just 20, he was already more than a small-time dealer. He had access to wholesale quantities of cocaine, and that made him the supplier in a dangerous chain. His role was to bring in the product, keep it moving, and ensure that those working beneath him always had stock ready for sale. Below Coe was Jayden Gibson, a 23-year-old who acted as the distributor. He dealt directly with users across Scarborough and Filey, feeding the demand with constant availability. Customers trusted him to deliver on time and with consistency. Gibson's phone later revealed just how relentless his trade had become, with hundreds of separate message streams showing orders being placed like someone might order a takeaway meal. The third piece of the puzzle was Joshua Rhodes. At 20, he acted as the facilitator, linking Coe and Gibson, helping to expand the reach of their trade. Rhodes was the kind of figure who made the whole operation run smoothly, moving between supplier and distributor, ensuring that profits were shared and problems dealt with before they grew too large. Together, the trio formed a miniature drug network, each playing their part. What made their partnership even more disturbing was the way they treated it like a business. They swapped customers between themselves, making sure that no one was ever left waiting. If one dealer ran out of supply, another stepped in to fill the gap. This cooperative style of crime ensured that their market never dried up, and it allowed them to build a reputation for reliability within a world where trust is usually scarce. But reliability in their trade meant more misery for their community. Cocaine was not sold in its pure form. Like countless other drug dealers, Coe and his partners learned that by cutting the product, mixing it with cheaper substances, they could stretch their supply and multiply their profits. What users thought was cocaine often contained dangerous additives, making an already destructive drug even riskier. Every gram they cut meant more money in their pockets and more damage done to those buying from them. When investigators finally seized their devices, the evidence was staggering. Gibson's phone alone contained over 300 separate conversations with customers, all relating to drug supply. Photos on the phones showed cocaine being weighed, bagged, and prepared for sale. These were not one-off deals or occasional slips. This was a structured business model that thrived on consistency and volume. Cash was also recovered, further proof of the money flowing through their hands. It was not the fortune of international traffickers, but for men in their early 20s, it was a powerful incentive. Easy money, fast recognition, and a sense of control pulled them deeper into a trade that would eventually strip them of everything. The reality of their network was clear. Coe provided the supply, Gibson ensured its distribution, and Rhodes kept the machine oiled and functioning. Each role reinforced the other, creating a cycle that left little room for escape. And yet, it was their own arrogance and reliance on phones, the very tools that made their business run, that would eventually unravel it all. The downfall of this network began not with a dramatic raid or a targeted operation, but almost by accident. In August 2024, Joshua Rhodes was arrested for an unrelated matter. At first, his detention appeared routine, just another name passing through the system. But what he carried with him would become the single thread that, once pulled, unraveled the entire web. When officers seized his phone, they expected little more than the usual fragments of information. Instead, they uncovered a digital treasure trove. Forensic analysis revealed thousands of messages, evidence that painted a clear and damning picture of his role. Investigators found more than 300 separate drug-related conversations, each one linking Rhodes to supply chains, buyers, and, most importantly, his partners. It was proof not of casual offending, but of organized criminal activity sustained over time. Phones are the lifeline of modern drug networks. They hold the customer lists, the coded language, and the records of every transaction. Rhodes's phone was no exception. It showed how dealers used multiple aliases, hiding behind nicknames in an attempt to outsmart the law. Yet the patterns were obvious to experienced detectives. Conversations that at first seemed cryptic, references to white, tickets, or bits, quickly revealed themselves to be slang for cocaine deals. The sheer volume of messages removed any doubt about the scale of their operation. What made the discovery even more significant was how it connected Rhodes directly to Coe and Gibson. Exchanges between the three highlighted a well-organized system. If one line went quiet, another number would pick up the trade. This constant handover kept the flow of drugs uninterrupted and customers satisfied. It was a system designed for resilience. But the phone records exposed its every weakness. Investigators methodically pieced the puzzle together. The data showed the network's reach, stretching across Scarborough and Filey, and documented the way profits were shared. Photos stored on the devices went further, capturing drugs in various stages of preparation. Cocaine laid out, weighed, and bagged for sale. Combined with the messages, these images provided the kind of evidence that was almost impossible to challenge in court. Police also noted the arrogance behind such records. Dealers who thought they were being careful had, in reality, kept detailed accounts of their own crimes. In a trade that thrives on secrecy, the casual use of mobile phones proved to be their undoing. Every conversation, every image, every exchange of money was preserved, waiting to be read by the very people they feared most. What began as a single arrest quickly snowballed into a major investigation. Within months, detectives had mapped out the entire structure of the network. Coe, Gibson, and Rhodes were no longer just names in Scarborough's underworld. They were now at the center of an evidence trail too strong to ignore. And as each message was decoded and each alias unmasked, the case against them grew tighter, leaving little room for escape. By the time the full investigation closed in 2025, the story was no longer one of suspicion. It was one of certainty. Rhodes's phone had given the police everything they needed, and in the end, what these young men believed would protect their trade instead became the very reason it collapsed. By the time the case reached York Crown Court in September 2025, the weight of evidence was already immense. Detectives had pieced together not just fragments of a story, but a complete record of how the operation worked. Thousands of incriminating messages, hundreds of customer streams, photographs of drugs, and seized cash. All of it created a mountain of proof that would be impossible for any jury to ignore. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The defendants were young, just 20 and 23 years old, but the charges they faced carried the seriousness of hardened criminals. Prosecutors laid out the case with precision, showing how Myles Coe operated as the supplier, how Jacob Gibson acted as the distributor, and how Joshua Rhodes played the role of link and facilitator. The picture painted was of a network that had infected Scarborough and Filey, fueling cocaine use and leaving a trail of damage in its wake. The prosecution highlighted the arrogance with which the men conducted their trade. Messages openly discussed prices, availability, and even cutting the cocaine to maximize profits. Customer lists read like order books, each entry a reminder of how widespread the problem had become. Photographs, stored carelessly on their phones, showed the very product they were dealing. Clear, visual evidence that left little room for argument. Prosecutors reminded the court that this was not the impulsive crime of desperate individuals. It was a structured, deliberate, and profitable enterprise. Each of the defendants had played their part knowingly, driven by greed rather than need. The irony was striking. Men so young, with the possibility of building lives and careers, instead chose to build a drug empire that was always destined to collapse. For the defense, there was little to challenge. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Every conversation, every deal, every connection had already been traced back to them. It became less a question of guilt and more one of consequence. And so, one by one, the young men entered guilty pleas. There was no dramatic denial, no claim of mistaken identity, no effort to fight the inevitable. They accepted responsibility, at least in legal terms, for the network they had built and the misery it had caused. The courtroom heard statements about the wider impact on the community. Scarborough, a town often associated with tourism and family holidays, had been scarred by a trade that exploited addiction for profit. The case was described as a stark reminder of how even small seaside towns are not immune from the reach of organized drug crime. By the close of proceedings, it was clear the defendants' age offered no shield. Their youth might have once suggested inexperience, but the evidence proved they had operated with the confidence of seasoned criminals. In the eyes of the court, they were not naive boys led astray. They were active participants in a damaging and calculated trade. The guilty pleas brought the trial to its conclusion, but they also set the stage for the next chapter, sentencing. And the question remained, what punishment would be enough to reflect not only the crimes themselves, but the broader harm inflicted on an entire community? When the verdicts were handed down, the scale of the punishment reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the youth of the offenders. At York Crown Court, Myles Coe received a 5-year prison sentence, a term that underscored his role as the supplier and driving force behind the network. Jayden Gibson, who acted as distributor, was sentenced to 2 years and 4 months. Joshua Rhodes, whose arrest had first exposed the network, awaited his fate with sentencing still pending. The court was presented with the evidence once more. Over £1,000 in cash, hundreds of exhibits, and mobile phones filled with incriminating material. More than 100 separate pieces of evidence were catalogued, ranging from digital conversations to drug-related images. It was a stark reminder of how much proof had been gathered and how tightly the case had been built. Detective Constable Sam Rivers spoke after the hearing, his words leaving little doubt about the wider meaning of the case. He described the supply of cocaine as a scourge on local communities, a force that destroys lives and exploits vulnerability for profit. His message was blunt. Scarborough and Filey had suffered under the weight of this network, and the sentences handed down were a warning to others who might attempt to follow in their footsteps. What stood out most was the contrast between the age of the defendants and the severity of their crimes. At 20 and 23, they had futures still ahead of them, futures now interrupted by the harsh reality of prison. Instead of opportunities, education, or steady work, they had chosen a path of quick money and hidden deals. The cost of that decision was measured not only in prison years, but in the damage inflicted on an entire community. The sentencing brought closure to the legal process, but also raised uncomfortable questions. How had such young men been able to build a network so effective, so damaging, and so brazen? And how many others, driven by the same illusions of power and wealth, might be waiting to take their place? For now at least, the Scarborough network was dismantled, but the echoes of its impact would linger far longer than the prison terms themselves. The story of this case does not end inside the courtroom. Its true weight is measured in the lives scarred and the communities left fractured by the grip of the drug trade. Coastal towns, with their quiet streets and seemingly tight-knit neighborhoods, have become fertile ground for criminal networks. The young and vulnerable are often the first targets. Dealers know where to look: outside schools, in youth hangouts, and among those struggling with poverty or fractured family ties. For many of these young people, the promise of quick money or a sense of belonging makes them easy prey. What begins as running small errands or storing packages soon escalates into dangerous involvement in violent networks. The damage is not confined to the individuals pulled into this world. Whole communities feel the strain. Families see their children vanish into lifestyles they do not recognize. Local shops and businesses suffer when crime rises and trust declines. Residents who once felt safe walking along the seafront now glance over their shoulders, suspicious of who might be watching. Police records show that even petty crime, from thefts to burglaries, rises sharply in areas where drug markets take root. The profits from drugs rarely stay in the town. Instead, they flow back up the chain to organized crime groups, leaving behind only misery and broken families. Community reaction has been both fearful and determined. Parents' groups, churches, and local councils have held meetings to voice their concerns and demand stronger protection for the young. Some residents have described seeing teenagers, barely in their mid-teens, drifting away from school and into the shadows of these networks. Others have spoken about intimidation on their streets, sudden surges of unfamiliar cars, strangers hanging around, and a sense that the ground beneath their feet is being claimed by forces outside their control. For many, these changes have been subtle at first, but over time, they add up to a community that feels under siege. Law enforcement agencies have urged residents to stay alert to the warning signs of drug activity. They advise looking out for homes where visitors come and go at all hours of the day or night, a possible indicator of a base being used for dealing. Unusual amounts of litter, particularly discarded packaging, foil, or plastic bags, can also suggest drug use or supply. Constant noise, sudden flashes of wealth among individuals with no clear source of income, or young people being driven around by older adults in expensive cars are all red flags. Police have repeatedly emphasized that reporting these signs is not about prying into neighbors' lives, but about safeguarding entire communities. The broader impact of this case forces us to confront a harsh truth. Drug dealing is not just about money changing hands in back alleys. It is about the erosion of community itself. Vulnerable people, often the very young or those already struggling, are treated as disposable tools by those chasing profits. Every conviction tells the story of someone who thought they could outsmart the system, only to drag dozens of others down with them. The community, left to pick up the pieces, is often the silent victim in these stories. What stands out most is the resilience of those who refuse to let crime define their town. Teachers, youth workers, and volunteers have stepped forward, determined to offer young people better options than the false promises of the street. Their efforts show that even in the shadow of organized crime, there are voices willing to fight for light, stability, and a future free from fear. Yet the struggle is ongoing. Every arrest is a victory, but it is also a reminder of how deeply this problem runs. And for many coastal towns across the UK, this is a battle that has only just begun.